So this webinar is on AAC intervention for beginning communicators. So beginning communicators really rely primarily on non-symbolic modes of communication. So they are used to using gestures, facial expressions. Obviously, we're talking about AAC, so they have complex communication needs. So they're using maybe verbalizations or verbal approximations, some vocalizations, body language, etc. They may just be learning to use aided or unaided symbols to represent basic messages. And obviously, they advance and have different levels of abilities with respect to this. But again, we're talking about people and individuals in the early stages of this form of communication. So they may be using simple low-tech or high-tech AAC systems with or without voice output, and really primarily for participation and early communication. So beginning communicators really represent a range of individuals. This does not mean our youngest communicators. It just means beginning communicators, people that really are, starting to use AAC in really basic ways to express their wants and needs and to participate within their environment. So again, these could be young children with a variety of diagnoses, could be children, adolescents, or adults with developmental disabilities, or could be individuals in early stages of recovery from an acquired disability or disorder. So again, they are just learning how to use alternative forms of communication. So something that's really important with this population is to really think about the relationship between communication and behavior. And oftentimes this is the relationship between communication and problem or maladaptive behaviors. So oftentimes we get called in to do evaluations or different sorts of assessments or consultations because individuals are, really presenting with some challenging behaviors. And what's important to understand that through these behaviors, the individual is actually effectively communicating. And it's also very efficient and effective to use a behavior that gets an immediate response or attention or really, and oftentimes, it really has a communicative base that the individual is trying to express or, indicate some level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction with a particular activity. And we obviously tend to pay attention to more of those aversive maladaptive behaviors. But what's important again is just for us to understand that these are in fact communication, and we need to try and have a better understanding of why is the individual communicating or expressing themselves in this way. So thinking about intervention, AAC intervention for young children, we have to start early. So often we thought that the idea within the field had been that if we present AAC too early, that it's going to stunt an individual's speech and language development. And in fact, we find that that's not the case at all, and that the use of AAC really helps both speech and language development. And for individuals whose speech mechanism is just being refined or they have a speech delay, providing them access to a mode of communication as well as access to language, which we'll talk about a little bit more, is really, really beneficial and doesn't hinder them at all. And obviously we want to watch it closely, and if we notice any change in words or phrases that were previously used, then we have to adjust. But what we see more and more in the literature is in fact that the earlier the better, and that AAC use does not stunt any speech and language development. An intervention for young children really focuses on meaningful participation and having the individual engaged in an activity and being a more independent and active participant within their environment. And this can be done through creating predictable routines and routines for participation, but that's still okay, and that's still the direction in which we want to start and move from to support an individual's success. And we may also be adapting play routines and involving AAC in those ways, or sabotaging or manipulating situations so that an individual has more opportunities to communicate and participate. When we're talking about school-age children, our intervention strategy changes. We really do come and focus on the individual first, person-specific, student-centered. There are many different terms for this. And we really are looking at kind of a shared vision statement. We're thinking this is school age, so part of an individualized education plan. We're really honing in on what does the AAC piece look for this, how are they going to participate, how are they going to get the right intervention, how is it going to be implemented, something that we'll also talk about. And it's really critically important that these educational plans are designed around an individual's needs rather than what's existing within an educational institution. So AAC is really oftentimes customized to an individual based on their unique features, and that's also has to be represented within their plan. When we're talking about school-age children, we're talking about a really rich social environment amongst peers, with or without disabilities, depending on their location. And so we really need to emphasize social networks. And there are different ways of doing this and different approaches. PATH, which is Planning Alternative Transitions and with Hope, is really an 8-step program designed to bring together an individual with complex communication needs and his or her peers within their environment. There's also social networks, which focuses on identifying communication partners in really 5 different circles. So we have life partners, relatives, close friends, neighbors, acquaintances, staff, unfamiliar partners. So it's really kind of starts at the individual, who's closest to that individual, and then we move out from there. And really placing an emphasis on how does an individual communicate within these different networks. So the social piece is really, really big for our beginning communicators that are school-aged. When we look at adolescents and adults, all of the other things are taken into account, but we also have a real focus and emphasis on community. So we really want to look at the quantity and quality of participation within an individual's community. So how can we bring what we've done within the school environment and really bring that and generalize that outside of the school walls and into the community, and have an individual be a more active participant within their own community. And so we need to incorporate what's known as the ecological inventory, and that's really observing a typical. In order to do this, we have to really observe a typical peer engaging in a specific activity. We detail the steps involved. So what does, what do we need to do in order to complete that? And then we determine the skills needed for the individual with complex communication needs. So what can they do? What can't they do? What do we need to address? And then we design communication supports to help teach the specific skills that are needed for the activity. So again, our focus is really on the individual's active participation within their community and these specific activities, having them be a meaningful participant. With respect to any intervention, communication partners are essential. So the facilitator, also known as communication partners, really need to know a number of things to help ensure that they are, as part of this cohesive team when we're thinking about intervention for individuals with complex communication needs. So communication partners need to know how to identify and respond to that non-symbolic behavior. So what does that behavior mean? How do I address it? How do I think of that as communication? How do I diffuse the situation? What AAC supports are provided? How do I ensure that those aren't negatively associated with the behavior or the context? And that rolls into understanding that behavior has a purpose and consider the meaning behind it. And then, really being able to distinguish the signals for communication and how to respond accordingly. And we've talked a lot about, and we'll talk more about, modeling appropriate communication or, diffusing a situation, but making it a teaching moment so that an individual who may be using maladaptive behaviors to express themselves can use more appropriate modes of communication. And this, obviously, the relationship and rapport extends beyond just just working with maladaptive behaviors. It's also when we think about participation. So how does a communication partner facilitate that? Thinking back to the, social, linguistic, strategic, operational competencies, how does a communication partner really help an individual have that meaningful participation and engagement? So the rapport, the relationship, their intuition that is built over time and working with these individuals is really powerful and a powerful asset to an intervention. So again, we cannot emphasize enough how important communication partners are in thinking about intervention for these individuals. So where do we start? What are some goals and starting points for intervention? So intervention for beginning communicators really starts to address getting attention, accepting certain things and rejecting certain things in appropriate, universally understood manners. So again, we've talked about how oftentimes these are done in inappropriate ways or in really effective and efficient ways, which involve behaviors. You know, having a behavior or demonstrating behavior is much quicker and easier than finding a communication book and pointing to a few pictures and ensuring that your message is understood. So we have to really kind of address that in our intervention and try to help hone in on some of these major starting points. It's really important to know that when we talk about attention getting, accepting, and rejecting, that these are the only things that we address. No, these are just the starting points for intervention. And from here, we launch into much more, refined and advanced things to which we work on for AAC use. But some intervention strategies for these major starting points can be addressed through scripted routines. You can also work on, we talk about sign or gesture dictionary, so helping communication partners understand what those behaviors mean, and also what are we doing, what signs are we modeling and helping shape and teach to that individual in order to help them get attention or to indicate that they want something more or they accept that task or rejecting it or denying it. And also visual supports are really beneficial. Sometimes we think about them as just major behavior modification tools, but they're really receptive input tools that help an individual not only understand the expectation, but also be able to be more successful in an intervention session. So visual schedules are really important. And then we may have some switches. We also may have some high-tech or low-tech AAC involved in our intervention when we're working on trying to gain attention, work on accepting and rejecting as well. Important to note that when using these aided tools, such as visual schedules, switches, and high-tech or low-tech tools, they often require joint attention. So we'll need to address some of those things as well if an individual presents with challenges in that area. So in addition to what we just talked about with attention, rejection, and accepting, we also have to really hone in on language. And so this is really just a brief overview of what are those different components of language, and there's much more information on this in other webinars about actual language and language stages. But just in general, language is composed of phonology, which is speech sounds, and those are really critical for language and literacy development. It also is composed of semantics, which is our understanding of words and how they relate to one another. Syntax, which is the rules that govern word order. Morphology, which are the smallest units of meaning and are really, the morphology refers to the rules that govern how we build and change words for tensing and all that kind of stuff. And obviously we also have pragmatics, so that's really the communicative function of language. So we have to kind of think about all of these and how and where and what are we going to start with that individual. And we can't ignore or just hone in on one in particular, because language is, again, composed of all of these pieces. And there are a lot of different resources of how we address literacy and phonology for individuals that have complex communication needs. And often these tools, AAC systems, are really essential for helping them develop and manipulate sounds in ways that their articulatory system doesn't let them. So language learning. So we really, as our goal for helping teach language and as part of our intervention is we support language learning and development for individuals by translating language into a visual form. And so these AAC tools can really offer a benefit. So we talked a little bit before about thinking about how for individuals who have apraxia, for example, having access to an AAC tool helps them say things that they may not necessarily be able to articulate. And with that same kind of idea in mind, we think about how language is now represented in this visual form. So that can be challenging and requires us to address it in intervention. How do we all of a sudden make this really, it's now becoming very symbolic, and that takes a certain cognitive level and cognitive load, and so we do have to really address that. But at the same time, it makes language tangible. You can see it. You can see combining words. You can see different parts of speech. You can have a symbol that represents that action, which helps bring greater meaning and context. There are lots of ways in which we represent these symbols, so they can be organized in many different ways. The three major categories are grid displays, visual scene displays, and hybrid displays. So grid displays are basically what we see even on the picture there. So with the low-tech language board, it's set up in a grid, populated with different icons. And so they can be organized in different ways. So we can have a semantic syntactic organization, which has vocabulary kind of set up by parts of speech. So we can see in the image on your screen, we have pronouns that are the orange color, we have verbs that are the magenta color, so they're organized by their parts of speech. We also have taxonomic organization, which is really kind of categorization. So we can go for the animals page to get to animal words, we can go to the little words page to get to our determiners, we can go to our verbs page to get to our action words, and so on. We can also then have them organized by activity. So what are all the words, irrespective of what part of speech they are, what are the words and vocabulary need for a specific activity? And so we can organize in that way. That also provides a little bit more context, which could be beneficial for individuals. And then we also have a pragmatic organization dynamic display, which is a pretty specific organization method known as POD. And that has kind of a combination of displays that's really designed to support pragmatic language. So it's kind of a combination of all of, semantic, syntactic, taxonomic, and activity, in the sense that it's really about what's the pragmatic function in that context. So rather than organizing by animals or colors or clothing, it's I have something to say, something hurts, I want to go somewhere. And then once you make that selection, you open up a new page, or then you get to the vocabulary associated with that feeling, that action, that place, that activity. So it's very dynamic, but kind of involves a lot of what we just talked about. So in addition to grid displays, we also have visual scene displays, and these are really scenes associated with a specific activity. These are really beneficial for individuals that need the context. So often these grids are context irrelevant. It's just a grid of words and different words and different parts of speech, and that can be really overwhelming, and some individuals may also not be ready for it or may not be meaningful. So visual scene displays really kind of take into consideration the context. And so if we're talking about eating and sitting at the dinner dining room table, we have a picture of the dining room table and the vocabulary, words, and phrases associated with that context. And then there's a hybrid display, which has a combination of the two. So you have combination of the grid in addition to a visual scene. So you kind of set the context, and then you have your vocabulary organized in a specific way. And then we also have to think about creating message units. So one symbol, one button, one picture. Does that mean a paragraph? Does it mean a word? Is it a morpheme, or is it a single letter? And that will really vary depending on the individual, their literacy level, as well as many other factors. But that's all that goes into our intervention when we're thinking about kind of teaching language and how we start with that. We can also think a lot about instructional approaches. So we have explicit instruction. So we teach an apple is an apple. We teach words as they are, and we have a very explicit and systematic approach. There's also incidental teaching. So in the context of activities, we embed these teaching moments. And so it's really the opposite in many ways of explicit. So we're not going to do these 5 sets of words. We're maybe going to get to them, but in the context of play. And then we also have kind of, along with these conversational coaching, so facilitator can provide a range of prompting techniques depending on the individual, that are really designed to support conversation. Um, and so it's in the context of these conversations that we address the AAC use, and our AAC goals. There's also strategy instruction, which is really like a systematic approach. So we define the goals, we explain it, we demonstrate it, we set the context, we practice it, we provide feedback, we then evaluate progress, and then we generalize from there. And many clinicians are kind of using a combination of these to really help support an individual achieve AAC goals and to learn their system and to learn how to use it for social and strategic purposes. And then we also have language modeling. And so there are three major different kinds of language modeling that ultimately do the same thing, but they just vary slightly. So aided language stimulation was first noted by Goossens, and that's really the act of kind of pointing to an icon or an icon on an individual's display and including that in our own conversation and modeling different words and phrases as we speak. And then we have a system for augmenting language, and that's the same idea but with high-tech devices with speech output. And aided language modeling, or AAC modeling, is also really the same idea in terms of using various forms of AAC in the same way. We are pointing to icons and using the icons or symbols or paragraphs or phrases or whatever they are in our own conversation as we talk with the individual. So our intervention also really has to support linguistic and social competence. Thinking back to those operational, strategic, social competencies, the 4 competencies that we talked about before, we really have to focus in on linguistic as well as social competency. So our emphasis of this in intervention really helps support development of semantics, syntax, grammar, and pragmatics. And so we can use a variety of those approaches we just talked about to address each of these and all of these. And we often have to use a combination of strategies in order to do it. So we may have some explicit and combined with incidental. We may do it the whole way through, either explicit or incidental. We're doing aided language stimulation or modeling. But we have to kind of keep an eye, especially with beginning communicators, on having it be functional whenever possible. So isolated drill work may not really help support generalization, which is our ultimate goal. And also when we're dealing with behaviors and maladaptive behaviors, we want to make sure that what we're doing is really meaningful and is going to have a direct impact on their meaningful participation. So whenever possible, our intervention context should be functional, and our goals should be too. And so we also want to hone in on those pragmatics. So it's not just about requesting. It's about, obviously making choices, making requests, but also rejecting, saying no in really socially appropriate ways, answering yes/no questions, having social interactions and engagement with other peers or adults, initiating, asking questions. So much of the time, our AAC users are responders. They rarely have the opportunity to ask a question. Commenting. That's, I feel like, a lot of what we do, but we so rarely hone in on this in intervention. So it's important that we really pay attention to all of these things, and obviously also conversational repairs, repairing communication breakdowns. So all of these things, again, can be taught using a range of different strategies. And the strategies really are specific to the individual and their goals and their abilities. And again, it's rare that one strategy works for one person, and we intuitively use a variety. As thinking about how functional things are, we also have to make sure that they're age appropriate. Always have the eye and the mind for generalization. How are we going to support carryover beyond the context of our intervention session? We have to keep a careful eye on those behaviors. Are we reducing behaviors? Are we increasing frustration? Are we being successful at helping replace maladaptive behaviors? And all those questions and ideas have to be taken into consideration. So AAC and literacy. AAC is really a powerful intervention tool and can really help an individual develop literacy skills. Um, and as we know, literacy is essential. Literacy supports our cognitive development, helps support social relationships. It gives us access to a range of technologies and activities and essentially the world. So it's really important to have literacy skills. Um, for individuals with complex communication needs, their literacy skills help expand their communication options. It also elevates their expectations. It provides that visual support for language learning. It also gives individuals, a good sense of self-esteem and self-confidence. It's really powerful being able to possess those literacy skills. And literacy skills are progressive, so we have emergent and early literacy skills that obviously move into advanced skills, and there's no reason why any individual with complex communication needs should not be engaging in literacy-based activities. Even if someone is labeled as a non-reader, that is no reason why we can't continue to involve them and expose them. And it's amazing what through this repetitious exposure, individuals will develop over time. And I so often see that individuals with complex communication needs on my cases are really quick to develop sight word skills because they're constantly being exposed to symbols and words and symbols and words, and then they hear the voice output paired with it, and so they really build some really great skills. And so it's critical that we focus on literacy for individuals with complex communication needs and even our beginning communicators. There are really 5 components that are identified in supporting AAC and literacy, and that's providing sufficient time, targeting appropriate skills, using effective improvement techniques, and there's some information out there about what these techniques are and how they may vary for different individuals with different profiles. We also have to provide necessary instructional adaptations. Sometimes just the smallest adaptations or alterations or adjustments or adding an icon there or the same symbol set from an individual's device to an activity material can make all the difference and really help make that connection and build a skill set. And we also have to build positive rapport and make it motivating. It can be challenging, but it can be unbelievably rewarding in the long run. So we really do have to focus on literacy. And also that comes when we talk about writing. And so often we hear, oh, well, they can't even hold a pencil. That doesn't matter. Use a stamp or use markers to circle things or stick down pictures or, there are all different ways that people can still engage in these literacy-based activities and have a sense of accomplishment with them. And that's what we really need to focus on. And so that leads us to think about inclusion and implementation within academic environments. So inclusive education really practices and outcomes that take place primarily in the general education classroom. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all individuals are in there, or they may be have a combination, be partially included. But there's, lots of mandates that ensure that individuals with complex communication needs get access to the right services and, as part of No Child Left Behind, as well as all the different standards detailed within an individual's education plan. And also we have transition planning and those kind of things that we have to start early and think about what an individual needs to work on now, thinking 5 years down the road. And oftentimes we see this comes in conflict a little bit because we think of an IEP as an annual thing. We really hone in on the annual, what are we going to achieve this year? But that doesn't mean that we need to think about, or we have to still have our trajectory set by what are we going to see in 5 years, and that vision, and how we're going to help start building on that now, supporting these beginning communicators to help them get to where they need to get. Individuals using AAC can really be accommodated within classroom environments by implementing principles of universal design for learning. So if we cater to the extreme and we design our materials for individuals that need the most extreme measures of adaptation, so individuals who are blind or hard of hearing or need those pictures because they are still working on literacy skills, then we make an activity accessible for everyone. and that individual with complex communication needs using AAC still gets to participate, still gets appropriate peer models, still gets an opportunity to feel successful and be engaged and have meaningful participation. So there's a lot that we can do in supporting an individual with complex communication needs in their classroom environment. And obviously, on top of that, on top of making really well designed, universally designed activities, individuals also have their own accommodations that can help ensure they're successful. So there's really a lot that goes into supporting beginning communicators using AAC. But there are a lot of different things that we work on. So we, again, just to summarize, we really work on some of that basic communication, getting their needs met, helping replace maladaptive behaviors with some really good symbolic communication that we really have to focus on. And then we can't forget about language and building language abilities. And I get really excited thinking about how AAC can make that possible, because it's really bringing language into a visual form and making it much more tangible. And it also, AAC empowers an individual to have access to language as their speech is developing or in the absence of speech. So that has to be part of our intervention, as does literacy. And again, there's just no reason why individuals with complex communication needs, or even those who are basic communicators, aren't exposed to different literacy-based activities. So that's a summary of AAC intervention for beginning communicators. So thank you so much for watching.